There was a woman in Vancouver who invited her neighbors to a Tupperware party. And about 8 or 10 of them came. And she put out all the containers. There were a couple of neighbors who came who weren't interested at all. They'd just come to gossip with their friends, so they just picked up the Tupperware stuff and put it down and ignored it. There were a couple of others who were quite interested, and they looked at it and they said, well, we'd love to have it, but then they remembered that their husbands had ordered them not to spend any more money on that kind of thing. So they said, if we get these, there'll be trouble, so we better leave it this time. There were another couple of housewives there, neighbors, who looked at the containers and said those would be jolly useful, but really our cupboards are pretty full already, and we don't have much room for them. But they liked them. But they soon started talking about other things they wanted to buy, dresses, hats, other things for the kitchen. And they didn't buy anything ultimately, but there were 3 of this lady's neighbors who actually were interested enough to buy. One spent $10, another $15, another $25. And if you're not hard of hearing, just you listen. Do you realize that if you had been in Galilee in Jesus' day, that's about all you'd have got from him? Do you seriously realize that's how he taught? When he was teaching the crowd, that was his teaching. Seriously. He didn't mention God. He didn't quote from the Bible. He told little stories from everyday life, and he didn't even add a moral at the end. As a little child said about her minister, I like our minister when he talks to us, he has no morals. But Jesus didn't mention God, and he didn't quote the scriptures, and he had no morals. He just told a little everyday event and said, if you're not hard of hearing, then listen. And that's all they got. And it was his disciples who later said, hey, tell us, what was all that about? We don't get it. Explain it to us. But he spoke nothing but parables to the crowds. Nothing but those little stories. That's all he did. Now, I'm preaching tonight on a chapter I've never preached on before. But it's a group of parables about the kingdom, and I believe somewhere in it God has a very direct message for the West Coast Fellowship. Somewhere in it. But since it's parables, you might miss it. And there's a sense in which everything depends on the hearer when you're telling parables. And some will go away with more than they came with, and some will actually go away with less. Parables do that to you. They either add to your understanding or they take away from it. They're kind of very two-edged. And Jesus said that about his parables. So I think I'd better read the chapter to you, having given you a little bit of a shock. Did you think that was all I would say, Barney? You know me better than that, don't you? You're going to get a little longer than that tonight. But I wanted to start there because you need to realize how Jesus taught. I've seen people trying to teach the crowd out in the street, and all they do is throw the book at them and make a string of statements about God and point out the moral very, very strongly and think they've got the art of speaking to the public. They should go back and study Jesus again. He never did people's thinking for them. That's an important point. He didn't spoon-feed them. He told them something and left them to find out what it was all about. And many of them couldn't even be bothered to ask what it meant. He might be preaching to hundreds, and then only 12 men would come and say, what was all that about? Explain it to us, please. Which he then did, because he was waiting for that eagerness to have more. Well, now, it's Matthew chapter 13, And the first parable he told is almost identical to the Tupperware party. It's as ordinary as that, and there is no mention of God, there is no mention of the Bible, there's no mention of heaven, there is no moral. He just describes something that could have happened any day, any time, anywhere. That same day, Jesus went out of the house and sat by the lake. Such large crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat in it, while the people stood on the shore. Then he told them many things in parables, saying, a farmer went out to sow his seed, and as he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Some fell on rocky places where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came up, the plants were scorched, and they withered because they had no root. Other seed fell among thorns, which grew up and choked the plants. Still other seed fell on good soil, where it produced a crop, 100 or 60 or 30 times what was sown. He who has ears, let him hear. See what I mean? Not a word about God, not a mention of Scripture, no moral. Something actually they probably saw happening at that very moment, because right behind the place where he was in the boat is a field where sowers, I've seen sowers in that field doing just that. There is nothing extraordinary there. I'm quite sure the response of most people was, so what's new? Thought he was a great preacher. Heard a lot about him. So what's new? The disciples came to him and asked, why do you speak to the people in parables? He replied, the knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of heaven has been given to you, but not to them. Whoever has will be given more, and he will have abundance. Whoever does not have, even what he has will be taken from him. This is why I speak to them in parables. Though seeing, they do not see. Though hearing, they do not hear or understand. In them is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah. You will be ever hearing, but never understanding. You will be ever seeing, but never perceiving. For this people's heart has become calloused. They hardly hear with their ears, and they've closed their eyes. Otherwise, they might see with their ears, hear with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and turn, and I would heal them. But blessed are your eyes because they see, and your ears because they hear. For I tell you the truth, many prophets and righteous men longed to see what you see, but did not see it, and to hear what you hear, but did not hear it. Listen then to what the parable of the sower means. When anyone hears the message of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what was sown in his heart. This is the seed sown along the path. And what was sown on rocky places is the man who hears the word and at once receives it with joy. But since he has no root, he lasts only a short time. When trouble or persecution comes because of the word, he quickly falls away. What was sown among the thorns is the man who hears the word, but worries of this life and the deceitfulness of wealth choke it, making it unfruitful. But what was sown on good soil is the man who hears the word and understands it. He produces a crop yielding 160 or 30 times what was sown. Jesus told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. When the wheat sprouted and formed heads, then the weeds also appeared. The owner's servants came to him and said, Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where then did the weeds come from? An enemy did this, he replied. The servants asked him, "Do you want us to go and pull them up?" "No," he answered, "because while you are pulling the weeds, you may root up the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. At that time I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned, then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn." He told them another parable. "The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed which a man took and planted in his field. Though it is the smallest of all your seeds, yet when it grows, it is the largest of the garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and perch on its branches." He told them still another parable. "The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed into a large amount of flour until it worked all through the dough." Jesus spoke all these things to the crowd in parables. He did not say anything to them without using a parable. So was fulfilled what was spoken through the prophet, "I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter things hidden since the creation of the world." Then he left the crowd and went into the house. His disciples came to him and said, "Explain to us the parable of the weeds in the field." He answered, "The one who sowed the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed stands for the sons of the kingdom. The weeds are the sons of the evil one, and the enemy who sows them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the harvesters are angels. As the weeds are pulled up and burned in the fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will weed out of his kingdom everything that causes sin and all who do evil. They will throw them into the fiery furnace, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears, let him hear." The kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field. When a man found it, he hid it again, and then in his joy went and sold all he had and bought the field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant looking for fine pearls. When he found one of great value, he went away and sold everything he had and bought it. Once again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was let down into the lake and caught all kinds of fish. When it was full, the fishermen pulled it up on the shore. Then they sat down and collected the good fish in baskets, but threw the bad away. This is how it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come and separate the wicked from the righteous and throw them into the fiery furnace, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Have you understood all these things? Jesus asked. Yes, they replied. And he said to them, "Therefore every teacher of the law who has been instructed about the kingdom of heaven is like the owner of a house who brings out of his storeroom new treasures as well as old." I hope by the time we finish, I could say to you, "Do you understand all these things?" And you could say, "Yes." Then I could tell you, you'll be among those who can bring treasures new and old together. Father, I just pray now for the aid of your Holy Spirit, not just for me, but for everybody listening. Anoint my mouth and every ear, and every eye too, and every heart, that what the senses are aware of may become sense within, that sight may turn into insight, and that seeing we may see, and hearing we may hear, and understand. For your name's sake. Amen. It's about half a mile south of Capernaum. There is a horseshoe-shaped bay with sloping banks down to it. And I know that's the place where Jesus sat in a boat. The acoustics are perfect for thousands of people. You wouldn't need this kind of thing. They couldn't have one anyway. And in a boat, out in that horseshoe-shaped bay, everybody on the bank can hear every word. You know that sound carries well over water. Furthermore, right behind that bay is that sloping field, which to this day is still a field in which men sow seed in exactly the same way as they did 2,000 years ago. I've seen it. And out behind that bay, you can see the fishermen out there with their nets. The whole scene is set. There is hardly anything which Jesus said on this day which they couldn't see as well as hear. And eye gate and ear gate go together, you know, all through the Bible. I mustn't get sidetracked onto this. But listen, Vancouver isn't waiting to hear the gospel, but they are waiting to see it. And on the day of Pentecost, Peter says, that which you see and hear. And you'll find that again and again, these are partners through the New Testament, seeing and hearing. I didn't just come to you with words, says Paul, but with a demonstration of power. You could see something. Seeing and hearing go together. And so Jesus mentions the two main gates into the human spirit are the eye and the ear. And one in the eye is worth two in the ear. And, okay, you've taken the double meaning there. He who laughs last has seen the wrong meaning. The eye and the ear are the two main senses through which we receive communication. But how deeply they both go in is the question. That seeing they may see and hearing they may hear, and understand in their heart. And that last 18 inches is probably the longest journey. But Jesus quite deliberately used parables as his teaching method to the public. They were stories from everyday life which were perfectly credible, perfectly ordinary, sometimes so ordinary that people must have wondered why on earth he'd mentioned it. And he did not point the moral, and he did not mention God, and he did not quote Scripture. He just told the story. And he was waiting for a response on which he could build. That's excellent teaching. And I commend it to you, especially with people outside the church. Yet these very ordinary earthly stories were about the kingdom of heaven. I find that astonishing. He could explain heaven in ordinary, everyday terms. And he did it because he believed that his Father had created both heaven and earth, and that there is a correspondence between earth and heaven. There's a correspondence between natural and spiritual laws, for example. The more you understand nature, the more you'll understand God's nature. I'm glad that I had to do 3 years science before I studied theology. I learned, I think, more about God doing science, because it was higher critical theology at Cambridge that I had to wade through after that. But I think I did. So for Jesus, the earthly and the heavenly were very much closer than they are to most of us. And he could take the ordinary earthly and use it to illustrate the realm beyond. Again, that's good teaching, taking what people know and understand and filling it with a meaning, linking on to what is part of their own experience and knowledge, and building on that, an understanding of things that are way beyond their reach. But the two things I want to get very clear is this: parables had a positive and a negative aspect. The positive was to help people to understand, the negative was to hinder them from understanding. The positive was to reveal, the negative was to conceal. The positive was to add more understanding to those who already had some, and the negative was to take away from people what they already had. And Jesus' teaching was a sharp two-edged sword, and the Romans had two kinds of sword, a long thin one and a broad fat one shaped like that with a ridge down the middle. It looked exactly like a large tongue. And Jesus' tongue was as sharp as any two-edged sword. You used the long thin one when you fought with one man, but the broad fat one you used when you were dealing with a crowd. You slashed it from side to side, and it was a heavy, sharp thing, and everybody got out of your way. And when Jesus spoke in parables, he was using the broadsword, the sharp two-edged sword of his tongue, to slash through the crowd. Some of his parables are really terrible weapons. They cut people if they understood. So it's this double edge to the parables that we must realize. They're not just sermon illustrations or children's addresses, or they're not just to bring light in, they're to bring darkness into some. They divide whoever listens to them into two parts. Those who go away with no interest, even the interest they came with, and those who are so fascinated that they want to know more. It's a bit like doing a crossword. I'm not a crossword fan, except a very easy one. I don't know if you are, but I've sometimes got interested in a crossword. And I've started doing it. And I've got about 3 clues and fill them in. And then I am stuck. And I read these clues and I think, well, what on earth is that about? I don't have that kind of a mind. And I give up. So what happens? I lose even the interest I brought to it. It's gone dead on me. Have you had that experience? I literally lose interest. But if I get onto a few more clues, I gain interest, and I get a bit more and a bit more, and I begin to see where it fits, and I see that that word will go there, and so on. Now that's what happens when you listen to Jesus' teaching, when you listen to anything about the kingdom, but particularly parables of the kingdom. I think it could happen to some of you tonight. Some of you may lose what interest you came with by the end of tonight. It might be my fault, it might not. But some of you will gain interest in the kingdom. Which brings me to these particular parables, which all hang together, and the key word is understand. The bad soil, the hard soil, is the man who hears the word and doesn't understand. The good soil is the man who receives the word and understands. And all the way through, you'll find understand is the key word. It's whether the word not only gets through the eye and the ear, not just whether you see and hear tonight, but whether you understand in the heart. And if it gets through there, then you'll have more understanding of the kingdom tonight. But they all hang together. They're all about the same theme. And I would say they're all about expectancy. Expectancy. What you can expect to happen from the kingdom. That's the thread that ties them all together. And here I want to say that I meet many Christians who are wavering between a naive pessimism about the kingdom and a naive optimism about the kingdom, both of which are of the flesh. The Spirit leads you into realism. Now it's very important what expectancy you have of the kingdom. If you have too low an expectancy, you're going to be surprised. If you have too high an expectancy, you're going to be disappointed. If you're realistic, your hopes will come true. Hope deferred makes the heart sick. And if your hopes are not realistic hopes, then you're in for trouble. Let me spell this out. I meet some Christians who are very pessimistic about the future of the church. They say in the last days there's going to be a great falling away. There'll only be a few of us left. It might be just you and me at the end. And I'm not sure if you're sound. Have you met pessimists like this? I caricature, but you know who I'm talking about. Some of you have been there, and you thought the church was going to shrink, and only a handful of people at the end to greet the Lord. As long as he brings the angels with him, we can hold a meeting, but there won't be enough of us. Then at the opposite extreme, I meet a naive optimism which has often grown out of a reaction to the naive pessimism I've just mentioned. I meet many today who are naively optimistic and think we're about to sweep Satan off planet Earth, that the church is going to grow and take over the nations and rule them and then present them to the Lord. That is naive optimism. It's not realistic. And that will also be disappointed. There is a realism in what we expect of the kingdom in the future before the Lord returns that gives us a good hope. And all these parables put together a picture of what we can expect of the kingdom in this age. And they spell it out very realistically. I begin then with the first parable. We're in for some time tonight, but if unbelievers can watch the TV tonight for 3 hours, we can take a bit more than 20 minutes, right? Well, now the first parable is the parable of the sower, and you know it backwards. You could recite it. You've preached on it. You've been taught it in Sunday school. You've heard it again and again. I want to give it the title, The Incarnation of the Kingdom. That's the first insight we're going to get, the incarnation of the kingdom. The question is, how can the kingdom of heaven be re-established on earth? The answer is always by incarnation. It can only be done by being embodied in human beings who rule the earth. Therefore, the sovereign of the kingdom of heaven must be incarnate in a human being on earth to re-establish the kingdom. And the Son of God was. But a kingdom is made up of subjects as well as sovereign. You can't have a kingdom without subjects as well as a sovereign. The sovereign has been incarnated. The kingdom of heaven is now being incarnated in subjects. That's what's meant by sowing the seed. The seed is the message of the kingdom, and it's to be embodied in men. The soil is human. And we are taking the message of the kingdom and embodying it, incarnating it in human beings. That's how the kingdom will be re-established on earth. The sovereign was incarnated, the sovereign was incarnated, and the subjects are now being incarnated here on earth. Something of heaven is being put into human beings here and now. That's the basic message of this. God nearly always does what he wants to do by words. He created the whole universe with words. He recreates through words. It's through his word that a man becomes a new creation. It is by words that God does most things he does. That is why most of the gifts of the Spirit are word gifts. Word of knowledge, word of wisdom, word of prophecy, word of interpretation. He does most of what he wants to do by words. Most of the ministries of the church are word ministries. Apostles use words, prophets use words, evangelists use words, pastors and teachers use words. And the kingdom is incarnated in human beings through words. That's the seed. And it's to be implanted in human nature. Now, I want to look at two things. The statistics of sowing and the rewards of reaping in this parable. Both are very, very interesting. The first thing I want to say that I think may begin to touch the burden the Lord gave me for you tonight, and I don't know you, I don't know your church, but the first burden that came to me was that the method of sowing is broadcasting. It is scattering the seed. Now, you'd have to watch a farmer in the Middle East to understand this. They don't have fields like I've seen as I drove down to the States and back this afternoon. They're lovely big fields, flat, nice soil, plow it up, drill it. Do you say drill it here? What do you use? Drill? Seed drill. Get nice rows. You couldn't do that. That field behind that bay where Jesus sat in the boat and taught is a field you couldn't plow. It's covered with hard basalt rocks and stones which would wreck a plow. It's the hardest stone almost around. It's black, it's hard, and there are thorns, some of them 6 to 8 feet high, with spikes on them longer than my thumb. 2.5-inch spikes, the thorns in the Middle East. Can't get near them. And you've no idea whether the soil is shallow or deep. You just see a little patch of soil here and a little patch there. But those people have to use that land. It's the only land they've got. And I've watched a sower going down that, through that field. And he does what I've actually done in my earliest days on the farm. Anybody ever done it? You carry a round container of seed and you develop a rhythm. And you take a handful out and just do that down the row. Anybody seen that kind of thing? That's how they sow. It's the only way you could sow in that territory. You have to broadcast it. You can't place it. You have to scatter it and hope for the best. Now, I'm beginning to say something which you need to hear. I'll come right at the end to the great contrast there is between fishing and shepherding, between evangelizing and pastoring. There is a total difference, and we have real difficulty adjusting to the two, because the seed has to be broadcast, thrown all over the place. You can't place it as you can plant your house plants. You scatter it. You broadcast the message of the kingdom. Sometimes it feels like trying to fill a lot of jam jars from a hose pipe. That's broadcasting, hoping that some will drop into some jam jar. But that is the method Jesus used. It is a wasteful method, but there's no other way to sow. And the statistics of sowing, let's assume that the 4 times Jesus said some fell, some fell, some fell, some fell. Let's just say that that means a quarter fell, a quarter fell, a quarter fell, a quarter fell. It may not have been exactly that, but for the purposes of understanding the parable, just assume that he's talking about 4 quarters of the seed. And what he's saying is 3 quarters was wasted. And you've got to live with that and face it. Otherwise, you won't sow. Now, you know perfectly well what caused the wastage. I'm not going to draw that out. You've probably preached on it yourself. Jesus knew what was in man. He had no illusions. He knew there were some so hard, maybe gospel-hardened, or they'd heard preachers so often, or they'd had such tough experiences in life that had hardened them off. So many people had trampled over them that they just weren't receptive to any good news. You met people like this? He knew some were hard. And he knew that they'd no sooner heard than what had been said would be forgotten within minutes. And that Satan would see they forgot it and keep them hard. He knew there were people like that. No penetration of the word. It just went... I saw a secretary in London. She had 2 new earrings. One said in and the other said out. and that's exactly what he was talking about. You see? Now, he also knew there was a second group of human beings who are too shallow. They'll get very emotional. They'll receive the news with joy, have a good old sing and dance about it, and it doesn't lead to anything. Especially when the way gets a bit tough and trouble begins. And some people, I'm afraid, made Christian professions and nobody told them that that's the beginning of trouble. I couldn't tell you that when I came to Christ my troubles were over. They began when I came to Jesus. And they got much worse when I got filled with the Spirit. Somebody said, I was asked by a minister, what's the infallible sign of being filled with the Spirit? How do you know? I said, I can tell you trouble. If you've not got into further trouble, I question whether you've been filled with the Spirit. I have a sound scriptural basis for that, because the most frequently mentioned sign of being filled with the Spirit in Acts is not tongues, but boldness. And the boldness always got them into trouble. So there are those who, as soon as they realize that getting to know Christ gets you into trouble and being filled with the Spirit gets you into more trouble, they're off. They like the choruses and the singing. They heard the word with joy, but very shallow. Got no deeper than their feelings. And then there's this third group, whose lives are already too full of other things, who think of the kingdom as a nice optional extra, you know. I've got the job I want, I've got a nice house that I've paid the mortgage off, I've got a nice car, it'd be lovely to have a nice church to go to on Sunday as well. Do you know what I mean? As if Jesus just is the icing on the cake, as if a bit of good religion would just complete it all. But their lives are already too full. And it's interesting that Jesus said they're too full of wealth and worry. Those two go together. The more you have, the more you're worried about how to keep it. And you start reading the stock exchange more than your Bible. And Jesus knew there were people like that. And he said, it's all wasted on those three groups. 3/4 of the seed is wasted. It's gone. Actually, many evangelists would not say that. They would say that only 1/4 was wasted. Because in fact 3/4 made a decision. 3/4 made a response. 3/4 received the word. And those are the evangelistic statistics we usually give, right? But Jesus said, I count those who get through to producing fruit. The others are all wasted. Because the whole point of sowing was to get some more grain. So in fact, 3/4 was wasted. That's how you should count. Not who starts the Christian life, but who finishes it. Because it's not the faith you start with that saves you, it's the faith that you finish with. According to my reading of the New Testament. It's not those who make a great response in an evangelistic crusade, it's those who 12 months later are producing fruit, whom you can say was worth it. But the point is that the sower went on sowing though he knew that 3/4 of what he was throwing out was wasted and would produce nothing. Now that's important to notice, because that's evangelism. And the farmer was a realist. He was neither a pessimist nor an optimist. A pessimist would have said 3/4 wasted. An optimist would have said 3/4 grew. A realist says 1/4 will produce fruit. But now look at the rewards of reaping. Just do a little mathematics. I've tried to do a bit. I think I've got it right. 25% of what he sowed produced an average increase of 60. Just over 60. 30, 60 or 100. So the average was somewhere around 60. And if that is so, 100 seeds got into good ground and produced 1,500 result. In other words, each seed that got into good ground produced 15 seeds. Do you follow me in that? 25% produced an average of 60% increase. So in fact, he was getting back 15 times what he put in, even though 3/4 was wasted. Now, I'm saying something about evangelism here. I've heard mass evangelism criticized because many don't last. True. But the word is to be broadcast. And from those where the word does get in, you'll get the return that the farmer was looking for. Now, this is profound in its implications. Because shepherds find it difficult to cope with wastage. Evangelists don't. It's the difference of gifting. And it's very hard for them to understand each other. How can you preach and get all those decisions and then see 3/4 of them go to nothing? The shepherd can't bear that. But the evangelist can, because he's a sower. Begin to hear me on this. Because in Australia I found some very good fishing churches who were bad at shepherding, and some very good shepherded churches who were bad at fishing. And there's a burden beginning to come through here that I think the Lord may be wanting to share with you. As somebody said to me, an evangelist, he said, I'd rather lose 80% of 1,000 people than 80% of 100 people. That sounded a bit Irish to me. But what he was saying positively was, I'd rather catch 20% of 1,000 than 20% of 100. Do you follow me in that? I thought that was pretty logical. He'd understood the parable of the sower. I'll go after as many as I can reach, even if I only keep a few. Because the few from a large crowd will be more than the few from a small crowd. Broadcasting. The method of incarnating the kingdom is to broadcast the seed of the word of the kingdom. To get it out as far and wide as possible, forgetting the wastage and doing it for the sake of the one that produces 30, 60, and 100. A missionary in Ethiopia, before the Italians invaded it in the 1930s and turned it into Abyssinia, that missionary labored far and wide, scattered the word wherever they could, but the only convert that missionary had was a blind beggar. One. Then the Italians came and pushed out all the missionaries. They had to flee. And some of you may be old enough to remember the atrocities of gassing and so on that went on. Terrible time. For years, the missionaries were kept out. When that missionary went back, that blind beggar had a church of 3,000 converts. You know? And the missionary realized that broadcasting it as I think it was a lady, as broadcasting the word as she had done, it only got into one. But look what the one produced, which made the whole operation worthwhile. I hope you're feeling a word of encouragement coming through here. It's not a word of criticism, it's a word of encouragement. The pessimist says so much waste. The optimist says, look how many responded immediately. The realist said, let's wait and see, but it was worth doing for what we will see. The fruit we'll get. Jesus, in the early days of his ministry, scattered the word wide and got up to 5,000 listening. And he got 12. In fact, he only got 11 out of that crowd who said, explain the parables to us, we want to go further. When he said, are you going to leave me too, like the 5,000 have done? I mean, Jesus preached one sermon and lost 5,000 people. He did. One sermon did it. They said, no, this is too much for us. Off they went. And he said, are you going too? Peter said, no. You're talking about what we want to know. The second parable we want to deal with tonight, I'm dealing at length with the first two, and then we're going to deal briefly with the rest, because the first two are the vital ones. This second parable of the wheat and the tares tackles the questions of basic philosophy which the greatest minds of the world have been tackling, ever since ancient Greece and before. And the question of evil is still the biggest philosophical question. How did evil get here, and how can we get rid of it? What is the cause of evil, and what is the cure of evil? How was it introduced? How can it be eradicated? This is the question which every major philosophy has tried to think through. And Jesus gave the total answer in a very ordinary little story about 6 sentences long. And they won't accept his answer. Or as a man said to me not long ago, he said, the world's in a hell of a mess. I said, if you're using that word like I'd use it, you're not far off the truth. Because hell means godless. But he recognized that the world was in a mess. Now the two questions are, how did it get this way, and how can we put it right? How did evil get in here, and how will we get it out? So in this parable, Jesus tells a very ordinary story about one field, 2 sowings, one by the owner and one by an enemy. And in that little story, he's told it all. And what he said, this is not a made-up story. This actually happens in the Middle East. I've known it happen in India. It happens in Southern Ireland. And that is, if you really want to play a dirty trick on a poor farmer, what you do is, after he's sown his wheat, you go and sow darnel. That's a semi-poisonous narcotic weed that looks exactly like wheat for about half its life. And it's only when the ears begin to form that you can tell the difference between darnel and wheat. And I'm afraid it has been used in Ireland, in India, in the Middle East. It's a really dirty trick when a man's livelihood depends on what little grain he's going to get to do that, because he cannot use that as food. It's dangerous to use. It has wrecked his little crop. So it goes on. So Jesus wasn't making it up. He was just saying, once happened, once upon a time. They all said, yeah, that's happened. So what's new? And the disciples said, tell us the meaning. And the meaning was, I am explaining to you the introduction of evil and the eradication of evil. The two basic things everybody wants to know. You notice that Jesus says evil is not an evolutionary hangover, nor is it due to the economic system we live under, nor is it because we live on an overcrowded planet. These are quite irrelevant factors. They're not messing up the world. And therefore, to get us under another economic system, or to get us a bit further down the evolutionary road of progress, will not get us anywhere. Why don't we listen to Jesus? The only one who's told us the truth about it. He says three things about evil. Number one, evil is alien to this world. It doesn't belong here. That's a profound philosophical statement, but I can't stop to spell it out. Evil was introduced to this world. It didn't belong here. It's not part of creation. The owner sowed wheat in his field. That's all. Therefore, let no one say that God is responsible for introducing evil to this world. It's a libel on the Creator. Evil is alien. It's unnatural. It was not here to begin with. The only thing you can blame God for was making a world that was vulnerable to it. But I don't think you can say that's blame. Just as if you have your garden, and you plant things in the garden, and someone else comes and wrecks it. And you call the police, and the police come and say, well, it was your fault for having a garden. It was your fault for making it nice. If you'd left as it was before you built the house, nobody would have bothered with it. It's your fault. You see how crazy this argument is? But men use it of God. The second thing about evil is that it's personal. It is not a thing, not an it, but a he. And until you understand that you can't talk of evil as a thing, you won't understand the problem. Evil does not exist apart from personal will. It's not a thing you can package up and introduce somewhere. You've got to incarnate it. Evil is personal. The Lord's Prayer we always say wrong. I guess you probably don't say it much. I think we should say it more. It's a prayer that keeps you right in your own praying. But the end of it has always been translated wrongly in English Bibles. Jesus said, lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. Not deliver us from evil, it, but from the evil one, him. And you need to pray every day that you may be delivered from him, and that God will not leave you exposed to him, which is the meaning of lead us not into temptation. If God wants to teach you a lesson, he just exposes you to temptation. Says, okay, you're on your own. See how it works out. And in the Lord's Prayer you say, Lord, please may I not need that lesson. Don't put me in that place where I'm vulnerable to him, but deliver me from him today. So evil is personal. It was an enemy that sowed the tares. there is a personal enemy of the owner of the universe who is responsible for the mess we're in. Oh, it says so much. You could almost preach a whole sermon on the devil from this one parable. It's, for Jesus, the devil is a fundamental belief. You could hardly be a follower of Jesus and not believe in a personal devil. The devil is an invader who can actually treat this world as if it's his. He can go sowing as if he owned the place. We know we are of God and the whole world lies in the grip of the evil one. He treats it as if he owns it. The devil is motivated by malice and hatred toward the owner of the field. That's why he did it. The reason the devil destroys us is because he wants to get at God. Not at us. He's using us to get at him. That's his motive. The devil's method is counterfeit, and what he does can deceive people for a time until the fruit appears. The darnel looks like wheat until it begins to fructify at the top. His aim is always destructive, it's never constructive. He's never trying to build something up, he's always trying to break something down and destroy it. He always works where the owner is working. Now that's a very important understanding of Satan. Wherever the owner sows wheat, that's where the devil sows darnel. So if God is working in your church, you better be ready for the devil to work too. Because that's where he'll sow his seed. But another clue, he always works in the dark, whereas the owner sows in the light. He always does it secretly. He doesn't want any publicity for it. Whereas what the Lord does is open and seen. You can see the Lord sowing, but you can't see the devil. I could go on, but this wasn't meant to be a sermon on the devil, so let's push on. The third thing about evil is something I've already mentioned, that evil is not only alien to this world and personal, it is incarnate, and the devil's method of planting his kingdom is exactly the same as heaven's. Hell has to get hold of people and embody. The seeds that are sown are the sons of the devil. They're people. The wheat is personal, the tares are personal. And that's his method, incarnation again. He's got to get hold of human beings. And he looks around for something in your life or in mine that he can get hold of. It's usually something we keep in the dark. And if you think of something you couldn't share with someone, that's usually where he will incarnate himself and grab you. Well, let's leave the devil now. I don't like giving him a lot of publicity. Jesus doesn't answer all the questions, but he tells us enough about the introduction of evil to tell us how to tackle it. And the basic insight is something that was supernaturally introduced can only be supernaturally eradicated. If human beings had introduced evil to this world, human beings might eradicate it. But we won't. It will take angels to eradicate the devil. We won't do it. It's a false hope that is not promised us that we will. We are promised that if we resist him, he will run away from us. But we're never promised that we will eradicate him or his kingdom. Now, we're coming now to the eradication of evil. As the wheat and the tares matured, the differences became obvious. And the sons of the kingdom of heaven, the servants of the farmer, became greatly concerned. They had a righteous indignation that this should have been done. And moral indignation can often lead to mental impatience. And you say, let's deal with it straight away. Let's root it out straight away. And I'm afraid moral indignation slips into mental impatience very quickly if we're not careful. So they came to the owner of the field and they said, look what's happened. Look at these weeds in your field. You didn't sow them, did you? And the owner said, no, I had nothing to do with it. An enemy did it. Well, then let's clear the field up straight away. I want to tell you that one of the most subtle temptations on Christians today is to become tear pullers. I say that carefully because I don't want to be misunderstood. I believe in church discipline. I believe in social action by Christians, but I do not believe in tear pulling. It's very important that you understand that this is something else that I'm talking about. There are Christians who are getting all steamed up about a tear pulling crusade. And you can work up a good head of steam on that, you know, when you're filled with anger at some of the evil things that are, come on, let's clear it out, let's root it out, let's eradicate it. And I'm just putting a cautionary word against this, lest we try and do what we can't. That's the human reaction. Let's have a purge. It is the reaction of the flesh all around the world. Let's purge our nation of evil people. Let's purge Grenada of the Cubans. Let's purge Europe of the Nazis. Let's purge. That's the human reaction to the tares, isn't it? Everywhere you go. If we could only get rid of that lot, the field would be fine. And every election we have, I hear it. I hear it. Let's kick that lot out and then we'll have it. Then we'll have the kingdom of heaven on earth. Let's get rid of the Tories. Let's get rid of the Labour they're sending them. Let's purge. Get rid of the people causing the problem. That is not heaven's method. And it won't work. It's the right idea, but the wrong time and the wrong people. The right idea is that someday every tear has to be removed from this world. That someday everyone who sins and everything that causes sin must be eradicated. If this is God's world, that's got to happen someday. It's the right idea. But listen, we are not the people who will do it, and this is not the time for it to be done. That's what Jesus is saying. The right time will be at the end of the age, and the right people to do it will be the angels. Not be the sons of the kingdom. The farmer will bring in another team to deal with that. He's not going to entrust us with that job of eradicating evil. Must have his own reasons for that. I could think of some of them, but they'd be speculation. We need to go back again to the owner's original intention, which was to have a full barn, not a pure field. Do you hear me on that? I'm going to return to this theme. It's heavy on me tonight. The owner's original intention was a full barn, not a pure field. But we keep wanting to give him a pure field when he wants a full barn. And if you start tear pulling now, there are two things that could happen. First of all, a case of mistaken identity could happen and you could pull up wheat. Boy, if somebody had managed to pull up all the tares in this world, I wouldn't be here now. Would you? And the other mistake that you can make is the roots are so interwoven that you'll disturb the wheat itself from growing properly, and you do more harm than good. Now these are profound things. The orders of the owner are, let both grow together until. Which means quite simply that where the pessimist says the tares are going to take over the world, and the optimist said the wheat's going to take over the world, the realist says both will grow together until. See how Jesus' teaching keeps you balanced? The wheat is not going to take over from the tares in this age, nor are the tares going to take over from the wheat. Both are going to increase, which means increasing confrontation to the climax of the final struggle between Antichrist and Christ. But the outcome is certain. The harvest will be gathered, and the barn will be full. But we mustn't engage in a crusade to eradicate evil. We mustn't try and live in the barn yet. Many Christians would like to live in a nice, sheltered Christian community up in them there hills and milk cows and sing choruses to them. Listen, the wheat and the tares have got to grow, both of them, together. Together. Did you hear that? Together. It's tough being in the world, but that's where the church has got to be. And the tendency constantly is to build a barn where we can all be sheltered. You cannot live in the barn now. You can only live in the field now, together with the other kingdom. We're too interwoven to start separating now. And indeed, Jesus prayed on his last night, Father, don't take them out of this field. Keep them in it and from him. That was his prayer. We can protect ourselves and our children. Too much. Sooner or later, our children have to live in the world with their roots interwoven with the kingdom of Satan. I wouldn't let our children go away to boarding school, partly because they had unhappy memories of boarding school, but one of the reasons was we both wanted them in the world, but in close touch with us so that they could discuss what they were encountering. And I'm happy to say they still share everything with us. And that was what we wanted. So they came home and told us what they'd seen of the tales. And we could talk it over. In the world, but not of it. Let both grow together. Now I realize this is a big debate now with state schools in the state they're at. But sooner or later, Jesus says, let both grow together. Sooner or later, we've got to be in there. Salt is no use in the salt cellar. Both will grow bigger and stronger, but here's a word of encouragement. The growth of the weeds won't hinder the growth of the wheat. Otherwise, we would be told to pull up the weeds. The wheat will grow strong. The integrity of the kingdom would be my title for this parable. Heaven's ways patience, and the owner will do it in his time, in his way, with his agents. But you notice a little phrase in there when Jesus says, now the field is the world, and the field is my kingdom. Did you notice that? The kingdom of Christ is not the church, it's the world. There are things in his kingdom that shouldn't be there, but the world is his kingdom. Canada is his kingdom. Even if you became a republic, you couldn't, because Canada has a king, and always will have. And all authority in heaven and on earth is given to Jesus. He said, the field is the world, and the field is my kingdom. And one day, everything that's wrong in it will be eradicated from my kingdom. Really, we need to see the kingdom as far bigger than the church. The kingdom is the world. And it's already the kingdom of Christ. Though many people don't realize it. But one day they will, when he calls his angels, not us, and says, now take out of my kingdom everyone who doesn't belong there. And everyone who does belong there, bring them into the barn, and the barn is the kingdom of his Father. There's a lovely switch there. The field is the world, which is the kingdom of the Son of Man. The barn is the kingdom of Dad. Mind you, one final thought. Isn't it beautiful that a creator can change tares into wheat? I think that's why he doesn't want to pull them up yet. We might have pulled up some lovely saints. Talked about the incarnation of the kingdom and the integrity of the kingdom. I think that's the right word. It can stand on its own. You don't need to purify the field. It stands in its own integrity. You don't need to clear the world up before the kingdom is strong and growing. The third area that Jesus talked about was what I would call the increase of the kingdom. And he rounds off his public discourse with these two very short parables. And usually when Jesus gave two short parables to the public, he always gave one to the men and the other to the women. Find that interesting. Like the lost sheep and the lost coin. There's one from agricultural life and one from domestic life, usually. And true to form, here he talks about the garden and the mustard seed, and then he goes into the home and talks about the yeast and a woman. He wanted to include all his hearers, get something that everyone could identify with. Again, a study of his teaching is a marvelous study. But every parable so far has included this theme of growth, but the question arises, how much growth can we expect? A little or a lot? What expectancy can we have? Can we expect the kingdom to grow until everybody in the world's in it? No. But can we expect it to grow a little? No. The two parables he tells tell us that we can expect a lot. I'm glad about that. There are differences between the two. The mustard seed tends to emphasize the quantity of growth, whereas the yeast or leaven tends to emphasize the quality. The first is growth in size, the second is growth in influence, and these are two aspects of growth. I'm afraid some people are only interested in growth in numbers, but God wants a threefold growth, actually. Growth in size, maturity, and influence. That's true growth in his kingdom. But the mustard seed, the story for the men out of doors, simply says the kingdom which was tiny will be huge. Like the smallest seed you sow in your garden, and a mustard seed you can only just see with the naked eye, which actually becomes the largest plant in your garden, and is a tree big enough for birds of the air to come and nest in. Incidentally, that phrase birds of the air nesting comes in the Old Testament and is used of Gentiles coming to the King of Israel and nesting in Zion, which is an interesting little reference. But I'm just thrilled to stand here and say that the church is growing faster today than it's grown for 2,000 years. Jesus said, I will build my church. I'm so glad he didn't tell us to. He's doing a very good job. And it's growing faster today. It's huge. I've got some figures for you just to strike you. Let's take 1900 to 2000. And let's take Africa and Asia. In Africa and Asia, between 1900 and today, the population has doubled. But by 2000, it will have trebled. That's the speed up. So 1900 to today, doubled. Today to 2000, trebled. You can see how the speeding up is coming. Now, what's happened to the church in Africa and Asia over the same period? Has it kept up with that growth? Between 1900 and today, the church in Africa and Asia has multiplied by 13 times when the population has only doubled. And by the year 2000, the church in Africa and Asia, on present trends, will multiply 34 times when the population has only trebled. Does that encourage you? That's what's happening in our world. A businessman said to me at a party a few years back, what's your job? I said, I'm the minister of a church. He said, what's it like to belong to a dying organization? I said, I wouldn't know. And he said, come off it. He said, churches are closing everywhere. It's on the way out. I said, well, the church I belong to isn't. He said, what's that one? I said, the Church of Jesus. And he looked at me a bit sideways, but I said, listen, every minute I talk to you, every minute, the church has 15 more members, even allowing for deaths. A net gain of 15 members a minute around the world. That's 1,000 an hour, 25,000 a day. I said, if your business had 25,000 new customers a day, would you talk about a dying organization? Well, that impressed him. And I'm one of those, having impressed someone, I then try to improve on it and lose him. Do you do that? You know? I thought, well, I've really impressed them, and so I'll say something even better. I said, and I'll tell you another thing, we never lose a single customer by death. And he looked at me, and I'd gone way beyond, and he dismissed me as a crank, and he walked away. Now, that was a few years ago. The figure tonight is 45 per minute. There is a net gain of Christians in this world of 64,000 a day. That's the church you belong to. The church we should get excited about. The mustard seed is becoming a huge plant, and the birds of the air are nesting in it. The Gentiles all over the world are getting in on the act. That's what this parable, it's an encouraging parable. It tells us to expect from tiny beginnings, 11 men, a huge church, a multitude that no man can number. It won't cover the world, won't be everybody, but it's growth. Real, significant growth. And it's faster, much faster than the population is growing in this world. And all you hear is the population explosion. Somebody should give a bit of publicity to the church explosion, because it is fantastic. You meet a man, I met a minister, not Yonggi Cho, a Presbyterian minister from down the road from Yonggi Cho, and his church is growing almost as fast, but he gets no publicity. Many churches are growing like mad in South Korea. They have Christian rallies of just under 3 million people. You know, and this minister was telling me about them, so I tried to look as if I was in the same league, and, you know, had quite a good time at West Coast the other day. And but listen, I thought these people had colossal faith. But in Yonggi Cho's church, the target he sets per month is 10,000 new members a month for his church. And he's seeing it. But actually that target is well within your reach, because his target is actually that each house group should win 2 people for Christ every 6 months. But when you've got thousands of house groups, it adds up. But I can relate to that target now. Every house group win 2 people in 6 months. Would your faith stretch to that? The growth in Korea is exactly that rate. So I want to encourage you into growth. And the second parable about the yeast is more on the quality than the quantity, on the influence. If the first is very visible growth, the second is very invisible. But what Jesus is saying is that the kingdom will permeate every part of society, and every part of this world. It'll just spread like yeast in dough until every part is feeling the effect. Not talking about converting everybody, but every part will be affected. There will be a day when there won't be any part of this world that isn't being affected by the kingdom of God. Something will be happening in that area that is the result of the kingdom being here. That's encouraging, isn't it? And he's promising that that will happen. The kingdom is like yeast that goes on operating until every part of the dough is touched. So the first parable says the small will be big, and the second says the part will affect the whole. It's encouragement. But you notice that it only happens when the seed is planted in the soil or when the yeast is mixed with the dough. I'm back to something we touched earlier. Separation of the church doesn't lead to anything. Church has got to be mixed right in there. The yeast has got to be in the dough. The seed has got to be in the garden. Otherwise, neither the seed nor the yeast would produce a thing. Right, let's move on. The next thing I want to talk about is the incentive of the kingdom. At this point, Jesus stops talking to the crowd, and he talks for the rest of the time to the disciples only, therefore to men only, therefore all his parables are to men. It's just little things I notice like this that make Jesus such a superb teacher. He switches his style from outdoors to indoors, from the public to the disciples, suits his material to the people. These men have received the message. They are sons of the kingdom, and it's cost them a lot. It's cost them their jobs. It's cost them their homes. So he's going to encourage them a bit now with expectancy. And he tells these two beautiful little stories. Again, there are differences between the two and similarities. The treasure in the field and the pearl of great price. The differences are these. In the treasure case, the man is not looking for treasure, and therefore not wanting it, but suddenly surprised by it. In the other case, the man is looking for a pearl. He's a trader, and he's wanting it. And some people find the kingdom through a long search. They're wanting something better, and so they go looking. They find the kingdom. Other people just trip up one day, and there it is before them in the street. It doesn't matter how you find the kingdom. There are many different ways. And there must have been differences among the disciples as to how they first either stumbled on it or came seeking for it. Nathanael was looking for something. I don't think some of the others were. Matthew wasn't. He wasn't looking for anything. And suddenly he stumbled on something that was even more profitable than tax collecting. So, again, in the first case, no one directed him to it. But in the second case, someone was trying to sell it to him. In the first case, the man had a sudden change of outlook. His future changed like that when he saw that treasure. In the other case, it was a slow build-up of resources, a search. There are many ways to find the kingdom. In one case, the owner didn't know what the field was worth. In the other case, the owner must have known what the pearl was worth. But I notice that there's one little word that is different. The man who stumbled on it suddenly, who wasn't looking for it, had joy. The other man didn't have such an emotional experience. His long search found fulfillment, but it doesn't say any joy. And I've noticed that again with people who come suddenly into the kingdom, almost out of the blue, suddenly find how wonderful it is. There's great surge of joy, and I wish I'd been a cannibal or a criminal when I was converted. Have you ever felt like that? Listen, the important thing is not how you found it. The important thing is just twofold. Number one, this is the biggest thing in your life. It's the biggest thing you ever found. It's number one now. It is the central goal, ambition, desire of your life once you've really found the kingdom. You can't tack it on as an extra. You can't say, well, I'll give an hour a Sunday morning to church and I'm in the kingdom. This is it. It's got to be everything. If you've really discovered the kingdom, nothing else matters from that moment. If you've really understood what it's all about, it is now your life. That's the first thing. It's number one. And the second thing is, it's worth making any sacrifice whatever to get that one thing. Everything else pales now. You'd give up anything else for this. Both of these men sold everything they had and didn't feel the loss. The kingdom has a way of taking you over. It really just so grips and almost obsesses, if you like, that you just say, right, that's the lot. I'm prepared to let anything go for this. You don't lose by it. Jesus said, no man has left family, houses, lands for my sake in the kingdoms, but he'll receive 100-fold with persecution. I love the honesty of Jesus. He put that in the small print, but it's there with persecutions. Don't listen to anybody who teaches prosperity unless they preach it with persecution, because that's honesty. Jesus did promise to prosper those who'd left all with persecutions. Oh, I'm not so sure I want to be prosperous. It's honesty. Well, let's move to the last one. I didn't know what to call this, being a slave to alliteration. I wrote 2 words down. You can take either of them or reject them both, but get the idea. The first was the indiscrimination of the kingdom, but that's a pretty complex word and people don't use it. So I wrote down second, the inclusiveness of the kingdom. This last parable is the hardest of them all to take, and I've never heard it preached on. Would you put your hands up if you've heard the parable of the dragnet preached on? 1, 2. Yeah. And there it is. How many of you have heard a sermon on the parable of the sower? You see what I mean? How we pick and choose in the Word of God. Now this is a problem one. It's a difficult one. But it's got a message, and I think the heart of my burden for you tonight is going to come out with this one. Go back to Galilee. They never fish with a rod and line. I've been out in the middle of the night with fishermen right in the middle of the Sea of Galilee fishing with them. I never saw a rod and line, never saw a hook. They use nets. And the problem with the net is it is indiscriminate in what it catches. It is inclusive. It just catches everything that's there, whether you want it or not. Now with a rod and line you can say, right, I won't bother with those little ones. There's a big salmon just over there under the shade. I'll go for that. And you go for it. You're picking. Or you choose a fly or a particular bait and you go for that one. But fishing in the New Testament and in the Middle East is not that kind of fishing, so we must forget that picture and get it out of our minds. Fishermen use nets, and therefore they get a real mixture in the net. Their aim is quantity first. Now that's going back to the first parable again. Their aim is to get as many as possible into that net. Their aim is not to catch good fish, but to get the net full. And when the net is full, they take it to the shore and they say, not that one, this one, not that one, this one. A good fish is one that's either edible or saleable. Something they can do something with. A bad fish is one they can do nothing with, so they throw it back. But they do it after the net is full. Now there's an important point coming here. If you'll forgive the pun, here's the catch. It's this. Groan. Forgive that. Number one, the angels will do the sorting, not us. Here we go again. We'd love to do it. It's not our job. It's our job to get the net full, not to throw the bad fish out. The angels will do the sorting. Secondly, they will do it at the end of the age, not now. Thirdly, some fish that have been in the kingdom net will go to hell. It's quite clear. Matthew repeatedly warns us of those who have related to Christ who can yet go to hell. Matthew 25 gives 5 warnings like that. Of those who are waiting for the bridegroom's coming, who will be in outer darkness. Now we've got to take these warnings pretty seriously. The kingdom net will catch people who are not going to be in heaven. And we must face the full implications of that. It's a big net. It catches all kinds of fish. And we must not do the sorting out. The angels will. My conclusion is that as of 1983, the net is not yet full. You follow me in that conclusion? Because the angels aren't kicking the bad fish out yet. The net is not yet full. Our concern is to get any fish into that net and get the net full. Now again, it's difficult for us to accept that concept if we've got a heart for quality rather than quantity. And yet here is Jesus saying, the kingdom is like this. and it gets sorted out in the end, but it gets a netful. Let me come right then to something that arises not out of here, but out of my last 2 weeks in Australia with the ministers of the Sunshine Coast. And I found that there was great tension between some of the leaders out there. Some of them hadn't even spoken to each other in years and hadn't shared the same platform in years. But praise God, last Friday night, God put them together on a platform, side by side, in full view of the whole church of the Sunshine Coast. He did a miracle. But one of the basic things that was coming between them was this. Some of those men were fishermen and some were shepherds. And they didn't understand each other. The fishermen were going for the big numbers and had a lot of wastage. Whereas the shepherds said, no, we believe in real care of each one, and we go for quality, not quantity. And they couldn't understand each other. And the risen, ascended Christ gave to his church pastors and evangelists. And they've never understood each other. And Jesus says, my church needs both. And I want the word to be broadcast wide. And I want the net to be cast wide. And you're just going to have to cope with the bad fish you catch. You're going to have to cope with the wastage and the disappointment, because it will be worth it for the harvest at the end of the age. And we need both. You see, I meet lovely shepherding churches that tend to stay the same size or grow slightly. I meet marvelous fishing churches, get huge numbers, can't keep them. And I think the risen Lord Jesus is just saying, couldn't you get it together? Couldn't my church have fishermen and shepherds together? Couldn't they be casting the net wide and caring for those they get? And get it together and have quantity and quality together. Neither saying they're the best because they have the biggest quantity or the best quality, but saying, hey, we need what you've got. You need what we've got. That's my burden. I believe the Lord is sharing that burden of his heart, to have a fishing, shepherding church. Well, I've brought forth from my treasures things new and old. Jesus said, if you're instructed in the law and the kingdom, that's what you'll do. Bring familiar things and fresh things together. What a beautiful balance in Jesus' teaching. In just one chapter, he's spoken of the kingdom as present and future. Get the balance right. It's both. He's spoken of the kingdom of heaven and yet on earth. He's spoken of divine sovereignty and human responsibility. He's got almost every major doctrine in balance in just one chapter. But just before I came, I said, Lord, how do we finish tonight? And he told me to tell you about Peter, whose first call was to be a fisher of men, but who 3 years later was told, feed my lambs. And he had to learn both. Now on the day of Pentecost, he was a great fisherman. He caught 3,000. But when he wrote his letter later, he wrote as a shepherd to other shepherds about the chief shepherd. Peter was one of the very few who managed to get it together in his own leadership. Very few managed to do that. Very few pastors are evangelists. Very few evangelists are pastors. So in most cases, you've got to get a team together. But what he told me to tell you was this, just to quote one verse. After the resurrection, Peter said to the other disciples, I'm going fishing. And the other disciples said, we're coming with you. I thought that was beautiful.